Welcome back. Thank you for coming in from lunch. We will get underway with our next session. Dean Taha is giving me lots of interesting assignments, and my most recent assignment is to tell you that we think the restrooms are fixed. So we welcome you to use them all you want. And good thing we don't have many dudes in the room. No, I'm just kidding. It's if the restrooms are not fixed right across the hallway, if you go out the door to the right and to the right, you can find more restrooms available to you if you need. So. Okay, just ask around. It's fine. So, all right.
If all else fails, the dean's office has a restroom.
That's right. And there are some high-stepping folks from central administration here, so we'll just use that as an object lesson that we can get some work. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Okay. We're back, and I thank you for coming back. As leaders and faculty and administrators of universities, I think we have to guard against a tendency to be defensive. We can sometimes feel like as matters, and especially if we're lawyers or have lawyers, we can have a sense that we need to be concerned about liability, risk, that we don't need to say too much or admit too much, that we might get ourselves in hot water. Sometimes that's a matter of pride and liability and risk. Sometimes that's just a matter of wanting to believe that we understand and are doing a good job. And we all have biases in our minds that lead us to believe that we are doing the right thing if we intend to be. And part of what I hope we accomplish here today is to instill a bit of a sense of epistemic humility, that we may not know everything that we think we know. And that we may not understand everything that we think we understand. And I would also like to say this. I imagine that most schools are doing their utmost best to be legally compliant. I think that it is true that that is at least what we must do. Nancy on the panel mentioned that the legal definitions are the floor. And I think that legal compliance and legal structures and judicial processes are the least that we can do. There is more to do to confront this problem. It is not merely a law enforcement exercise. To that end, one thing I'm proud of from our organizing committee and from this conference is that we have intentionally invited students into this conversation, not merely the academics who study this or the professionals who have their careers on the line. We've invited students to be a part of this conversation, and we've already heard from one, Courtney Keel from Penn State. On the next panel, we will hear from Jasmine Lester from Arizona State. These are both recent grads. Courtney is still a student. Jasmine is a recent grad. And what we hope to have happen here with the student voices is for the students to be able to express what their experience is, what their experience has been, so that we as leaders and teachers and administrators can respond to that and to have a better illumination of the problem. Even here at Pepperdine, and I would say this at any school, and I believe that these stories are probably absolutely true. I will talk to someone who has a role in responding to these crises, and they say, well, this is what we do, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then I'll hear a story from a student who has had a good experience, and then I'll hear from a student who has had a bad experience, and then I'll hear from a student who has not engaged the process at all because she didn't trust it. And I think that we, as a school here, but then all of our schools who are represented here, need to think of ways to hear the students, to respond to them not merely from a position of legal compliance, but from a position of service and dignity to our students. So we welcome students into our conversation today. And to lead that discussion is our keynote speaker this afternoon. Dana Bolger is an activist, writer, and the founding co-director of Know Your 9, which you may find at knowyourix.org, a national grassroots student campaign to end campus gender-based violence. Dana Bolger has testified before Congress on sexual assault policy and legislative reform, and her writing on the subject has appeared in many places, including the New York Times, Al Jazeera America, USA Today, and The Nation. This past spring, she graduated from Amherst College, where she majored in law, jurisprudence, and social thought. And her job, her role today and in her life now is to empower students to advocate on their own campuses for justice in their environment. So please welcome Dana Bolger.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I feel so honored today to be sharing this stage with so many terrific academics and organizers and advocates who are and have been such game changers in this movement long before I was even born. There's a whole generation of us today who are fighting for safety on our campuses and justice following the violence we have suffered. And it's only because of the work that others have done before us and that they are continuing to do today that we are able to have our experiences heard, let alone give voice to them in the first place. Today, I will be talking about the work that students and survivors all across the country are doing at the intersection of law and activism, efforts which blossomed over the last 2 or 3 years, but which are built, like all good things, on the work and victories and failures and imaginings of students and activists and academics who came long before us. Students have been organizing against rape on their campuses and in their communities for decades. Just recall the Take Back the Nights, the Clothesline Projects, the Vagina Monologues, and all the protests and marches and op-eds and vigils that came before. What is so new and different today, in my opinion, not actually having been around 30 years ago, is that now we are calling out our schools' abuses not just as morally wrong, but as legally wrong, as fundamental violations of our civil right to education under Title IX. Title IX, of course, as we have heard often today, is a law made famous in the context of women's athletics, but it also prohibits sex discrimination in education more broadly. And it has, over the years, been understood by courts to require schools to act to both prevent and respond to violence after it occurs. And so while in the past, activists have focused on improving the criminal law to prosecute individual abusers, today students have narrowed in on using this civil law to hold entire systems and institutions accountable that are failing us. Our efforts have centered on a non-carceral response to violence. That's important. Today I'll be talking about my experience as a survivor and an organizer, and my work on the ground at my own school and nationally to start Know Your Nine. I'll talk about my concerns with the growing corporatization of higher education and what that means for student safety and well-being. And I'll talk about the corporatization of our movements and what that means for the prospect of ending violence. I'll conclude by highlighting the ways we can all do better and make Title IX's promise of equality in education for students of all genders a reality. Also, although I know this conference is focused on domestic violence on college campuses, I'm going to talk today about gender-based violence more broadly. I don't use that term to suggest that only women are victims, but rather to note that whenever a woman or someone of another gender suffers this violence in this way, it is almost always gendered. The reason I'm using the term today is to include dating and domestic violence and stalking in addition to rape and sexual assault. Title IX, as we have heard, protects all of these. And they, and these forms of violence, in my mind, originate from common sources. And yet there's this continuing historical divide between sexual assault service providers and domestic violence providers, nonprofits that do anti-rape work and those that do domestic violence work, academics that write about rape and academics that write about domestic violence. And on one level, that division makes sense to me. A single instance of rape and a period of years of abuse strike me as vastly different experiences. But on another level, this just doesn't make sense, particularly in the context of my own lived experience. I am a survivor of rape, stalking, and emotional abuse within a dating relationship. Being raped wasn't the worst part of my experience, but it is inseparable from it. And so, at least in the context of campus violence, I think it is absolutely essential that our national and campus policies and our activism center all of these experiences of gender-based harm. I want to start by showing you an image. So in 2012, a fraternity at Amherst sat down and decided to create this image, stick it on a t-shirt, and then sell the shirt to students in honor of the frat's annual pig roasting party. There is, of course, a pig on the shirt. It's in the corner, smoking a cigar, watching a woman, I hope everyone can see this, tied up with an apple stuffed in her mouth, being smoked over a fire. roasting fat ones since 1847. The Amherst administration opted not to punish the students responsible for the shirt, but rather to hold a quiet, closed-door meeting with a handful of students. According to a friend of mine who was present, the boys will be boys type comments made prior to the meeting. We were just a bunch of drunk guys sitting around on a Friday night designing a shirt, were replaced by apology, we didn't mean to offend anyone, and then some confusion over the real impact of the offensive joke. And that was that. A month passed, 4 months passed, the summer went by. The administration never saw fit to publicly discuss or even acknowledge this incident in a school-wide email, despite the fact that a number of students had seen or wore or were still wearing the shirt around campus. In my mind, the institution responded to this situation as a PR problem, as a potential risk to their reputation to be managed and mitigated. Their goal seems to have been to comply with some legal obligation to address the incident and then to move on quickly and quietly, to forego real engagement on the issue so that the institution's name would stay out of the headlines. They were largely successful for months until a couple survivors decided to do something about it. And it's that risk management approach to sexism or racism or mental health or violence on campus, that prioritization of universities' profit over students' comfort or safety or lives, that is one of the single biggest reasons so many students are being raped and then ignored, swept aside, and silenced by the schools they love so much. My own story starts in an office with a dean at my college. I was sitting across from him, this man I didn't know, explaining that a fellow student had raped and then stalked me, and that I was having a hard time going to a school on a campus of only 1,700 students with only a single dining hall and a single gym with a person who had hurt me. I asked my dean for my options to take disciplinary action against my assailant. My dean told me that it would be best if I took some time off from school, went home, waited for my abuser to graduate, and returned to campus when it was safe. I repeated that I wanted to know my options. He said I could get a job at Starbucks to fill my time off. I again asked for my options. He removed a framed photograph from his wall of some old college buddies of his at Amherst, chuckled, and told me that he too had taken time off from college when he was feeling overwhelmed, and that his friends didn't forget him while he was away. I left the office, packed up my things, and went home for the semester. The school never did refund my tuition. Later, I would come to realize that the way my dean responded to me that day was part of a larger pattern of administrators seeking to downplay violence, sweep it aside, and keep survivors quiet. I suppose for him, me leaving campus was a desired outcome in that the school didn't have to make any tough decisions about what to do with my abuser if I left voluntarily. It was a win-win, perhaps, in the eyes of the institution. Everybody got to graduate, the school didn't have to pick sides and risk picking the wrong side. Throughout, I felt like a liability, not a student. I felt like a liability that had to be managed and properly disposed of. It didn't happen like they tell you it happens in the movies. It wasn't at a party, and I wasn't drinking, and he wasn't a stranger. He was someone I knew well and cared for and trusted. I was shocked and confused. He started following me on campus, off campus. He would show up outside my dorm room at 3 a.m. and bang on the door and jiggle the lock. Some mornings I would wake up with 10 missed calls from him and a dozen text messages. And then one night he threatened to kill me. I spent hours of my days trying to figure out how to avoid him, how to go to our one dining hall without seeing him, how to get in and out of my dorm without crossing paths. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. School was beginning to fall off my radar screen. I was just trying to make it from one day to the next. Unaware that I had any other options, I considered dropping out. I told my friends what was going on, but I didn't go to a campus official at first. I knew that what he was doing was wrong, but it took months for me to call it what it was. My academic performance began to suffer as the stalking and harassment intensified, and I grew more depressed. Then one day, I was shocked to meet another woman who told me he had abused her too, 2 years before. A few months later, I would learn that most campus rapists are repeat offenders. In fact, the average campus rapist raped 6 times. 9 out of 10 campus assaults are committed by repeat perpetrators. That's when I knew I had to do something. If not for myself, then for her, and for all the women who would inevitably come after me. And that's when I finally went to my dean to try to tell him what had happened and seek justice. At his advice, which seemed vaguely unethical and distinctly unfeeling at the time, I left school and went home. I read the disciplinary procedures on the college website. They were confusing and often self-contradictory. Eventually, I did file a complaint against my assailant. Now, the presence of a disciplinary structure at my college did give me a structure within which I could voice my complaint and request remedy. But the existence of that structure did little to ensure that it was properly carried out, or more precisely, carried out in a way that was beneficial to me as a victim, rather than to my assailant or to the college. So, for instance, I was able to voice a complaint through the grievance procedure as a survivor, but as a survivor of dating violence, I could only articulate the harms I'd experienced halfway. The sexual misconduct policy recognized the harm of rape, which it termed non-consensual sexual penetration, and stalking, which it called sexual exploitation, but did not conceive of the other harms I had experienced: verbal threats, emotional abuse, and psychological intimidation, to name a few, all of which impacted my life more significantly than rape or stalking. Nor did my school's grievance procedures center around my needs as a victim. Given precedent at my college and others, my assailant was unlikely to be expelled or even suspended, and thereby would continue to walk the same campus as I, posing threats to my safety, my mental health, and my access to education. None of the available remedies made any attempt at preventing future violence or at addressing my various losses: tuition, dropped grades, cost of counseling, delayed graduation, difficulty sleeping. In the face of the increasingly apparent weakness of a system that was unwilling to account for the various harms I had experienced and to respond to them in a way that was even remotely helpful to me, I eventually dropped my complaint entirely, instead opting for a civil legal resolution outside of the school. Most of the survivors I know chose not to report or file complaints in the first place due to a grievance policy and process that were fundamentally unresponsive to their needs. To be honest, my experience is pretty average. It's not the best out there, for sure, but it's by no means the worst. When I joined a peer survivor support group on campus when I returned to school, I heard at least a dozen similar stories, and I will show you some now. These are photos of survivors at Amherst, including myself. They document the words that their assailant said to them and their friends. And administrators. Since I went public with my experience and created Know Your Nine, I've heard dozens and dozens of similar stories of institutional apathy and abuse. Over the past couple years, many of these survivors have come to be my closest friends. One friend was told she wasn't allowed to talk about her rape, not to anyone, not even family and friends. Another spoke out about her abuse as part of her activism, and then was dragged up on disciplinary charges of creating, quote, a hostile environment for her rapist. A male survivor was told that he couldn't call his rape rape because he was a man, and that if he was heard doing so, he would also be brought up on disciplinary charges. Others were denied campus counseling services, and still others were forcibly institutionalized against their will, lost academic privileges like writing a thesis or studying abroad, or were denied re-entry to the college altogether due to mental health concerns stemming from the violence. Survivors often transfer, abandon their educations entirely, or even sometimes take their own lives, all while their perpetrators go on to graduate college, often with honors. Schools ask perpetrators to write book reports or apology notes, take a semester off from school, or do nothing at all. My own school found a student guilty of rape his freshman year, suspended him for a semester, and then upon his graduation 4 years later, offered him a job at the college, traveling the country to recruit high school students to come to Amherst. Meanwhile, his victim had no choice but to drop out of the school, and 5 years later has not returned to any college to conclude his degree. Rarely do schools actually expel abusers. When they do, college administrators often extend one final act of mercy to rapists, declining to note the reason for their expulsion on their transcripts. Other colleges promptly accept them into their programs. My abuser went on to graduate college from another school and by all reports is doing just fine in life. Now I want to pause here to answer a question I'm asked all the time. Why are schools handling this violence in the first place? Isn't this a crime? Shouldn't it be handled by the police? These questions, well-intentioned, I know, almost always come from older, typically white, typically male individuals who seem to have more faith in the United States police and criminal justice system than anyone else around, particularly black folks, brown folks, queer folks, trans folks, disabled folks, immigrants, and women. Now, this question can wisely be broken into two. First, why do schools handle rape? And second, why should they? My Know Your Nine co-director, Alexander Brodsky, answers it, I think, quite well on our website. Title IX requires schools to combat sex discrimination in education. Rape and other forms of gender-based violence manifest and perpetuate inequality, and federal anti-discrimination law recognizes that. To make sure that all students, regardless of their gender identity and expression, have equal access to education, schools are required to prevent and respond to reports of sexual violence. This isn't a replacement for reporting to the police. It's a parallel option for survivors based in civil rights rather than criminal law. But here's the better question. Why should schools handle sexual violence reports? Number one, for many survivors, campus adjudication is their only option. Many victims of sexual violence don't want to turn to the criminal justice system, as others have elaborated already. They may fear skepticism and abuse from police, prosecutors, or juries. They may not want to go through the ordeal of a long trial. They may fear retaliation from their assailant, who will most likely not end up being prosecuted, let alone convicted, and they may be hesitant to send their assailants to prison. But even survivors who do report to the police are often abandoned by the system. Only a quarter of all reported rapes lead to an arrest, only a fifth lead to prosecution, and only half of those prosecutions result in felony convictions. Additionally, not all state laws cover sexual violence perpetrated by women or a person the same sex as the victim. Some don't recognize male victims at all. Schools, unlike the state, must take up every report for adjudication and response according to the victim's wishes. For most campus survivors then, the school may be their only remedy for justice and safety. Number two, colleges and universities can respond to survivors' needs that go unaddressed by the criminal justice system. A criminal trial is brought against a defendant by the state, not the victim, in defense of the state's interest. That means that a survivor's needs are often sidelined. In contrast, schools, unlike criminal courts, are focused on the victim and are required to make sure he or she has everything they need to continue their education. Examples include academic accommodations, dorm and class transfers, and mental health support. While many observers assume victims' first priority is retribution, that may be one, or none at all, of many valid needs, and the police just can't get a survivor an extension on her English paper due the week after he or she was raped. So Title IX guarantees a good deal to survivors, and just because schools aren't doing, in my opinion, a particularly good job of it right now, doesn't mean that the law is useless or its aim impracticable. Title IX prohibits many of the abuses I described earlier. Now, our school never told us that it was treating us illegal. In fact, our school often presented the fact that a disciplinary process existed at all as a generous gift to survivors, rather than something that was legally mandated by law. We never imagined Title IX applied to us as survivors, and so only once we did happen to learn our rights, often in the most happenstance, lucky ways, we were able to take action and stand up for ourselves. Back at Amherst, once we knew about Title IX, we read the law and learned our rights. We marched into meetings with administrators, the 2011 Dear Colleague letter in hand, and pointed at the sections where the school was in clear violation. When they didn't listen, we went public with our stories and called upon the power of the law as we demanded change. Faced with negative media attention and plummeting application rates, Amherst finally listened and slowly began to change its policies. So only when survivors learned that the law applied to them and the protections it guaranteed them were they able to recognize both that the college had violated their rights and what to do to seek justice, both individual and systemic. That, and experiences like it at other schools was the impetus for creating Know Your 9. Know Your 9 is a campaign to educate students about their rights under Title IX to an education free from violence and harassment in order to empower them to end violence on their campuses. The campaign is a little over a year old, survivor-led, student-driven, national, and about as grassroots as it gets. We started with an Indiegogo campaign to crowdsource money to build our website and place educational Know Your Rights ads in student newspapers across the country. Thanks to our many $5 donors and several $500 donors, and all of the people who believed in and supported us along the way, we raised over $11,000 in 1 month, and we have managed, despite the odds, to stretch that out ever since. We enlisted dozens of survivors and students to write content for the site and spent hours and hours editing it, late at night, after work and internships, in between classes, in classes. Many Google Docs and sleepless nights later, we launched the site with some 70 pages of resources for survivors and student activists covering anything a survivor could possibly need to know to get justice on his or her campus. How Title IX protects victims of sexual assault, what the Clery Act requires of universities, how to file a complaint against your college for Title IX violations, how to launch a media campaign to create change on your campus, how to deal with feeling exposed after telling your story to the media, how to deal with unsupportive parents and peers. And it's kept growing. Just this week, we added new resources on surviving dating violence, supporting a survivor of dating violence, and writing a campus gender-based violence policy that is inclusive of the needs of dating violence survivors. Dating and domestic violence have largely been ignored in the recent media coverage and activism against violence on campus. And while there are real particularities to dating violence survivors' needs on campus, often there's some experience with the institution or the community is much the same. So I want to show you some more photos. Turning to a more brighter note, last year Amy Poehler's Smart Girls team asked to make a video about Know Your 9 and our message to young women about their rights. So I thought I would show you that to give you a glimpse of what we do.
Title IX is a landmark federal civil rights law that prohibits sex discrimination in education. Title IX is not just about sports. It also addresses sexual harassment, gender-based discrimination, and sexual violence.
2. Title IX does not apply to female students only. Male and gender nonconforming students are protected too.
3. Schools must be proactive in ensuring that your campus is free of sex discrimination. They can't just wait for something to go wrong.
4. Schools must have an established procedure for handling complaints of sex discrimination, harassment, and violence. 5. Schools must take immediate action to ensure that a survivor can continue his or her education safely.
Number 6. Schools may not retaliate or let someone else retaliate against a victim filing a complaint.
7. Schools can issue a no-contact directive to prevent the accused student from interacting with you, kind of like a restraining order from your school.
8. In cases of sexual violence, schools are prohibited from encouraging or allowing informal mediation of the complaint rather than a formal hearing.
9. Schools cannot discourage you from your continuing education since you have a right to education under Title IX.
You have a right to remain on campus and have every educational program and opportunity available to you.
If your rights aren't being respected, you have options. Visit knowyour9.org and check us out on Facebook and Twitter.
Thanks. We measure our success as an organization in terms of the number of videos Amy Poehler makes about us, so we are good to go. But in all seriousness, the response to our work has been tremendous and the need far vaster than even we ever anticipated. We naively envisioned that Know Your Nine would be a quick 2-month social media campaign. We were very wrong. Since last year, thousands of students and their families have visited our site. School administrators have used our resources to educate themselves and their coworkers about their legal obligations. Pioneers in the field, like Catherine McKinnon, who first argued that Title IX did in fact protect survivors of sexual harassment, have praised our work. Women of generations older than ours have told us that they only wish such a resource had existed back when they were raped or abused and felt they had nowhere to turn, so simply dropped out and told no one. 3 Know Your Nine organizers were invited to testify before Congress this summer. Our work and our messages have made it onto the TV screens of both high school and college students. We've been fortunate to write for the New York Times, USA Today, and Time, among others. Students all across the country are taking action, and schools, I think, are slowly changing. And yet, we're not there yet, not even close. It's been 42 years since Title IX was passed, and some things have changed, I know, but 42 years later, we're still having Take Back the Nights, just like a generation of women in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. 42 years later, we're still hearing all the time about students who were assaulted and mistreated, left no choice but to leave campus for a time, or to drop out entirely, or to be forcibly institutionalized. Just the other week, activists published a list of rapists at UChicago on Tumblr, echoing the tactics of organizers at Columbia last spring, who wrote the names of their rapists on the walls of their bathrooms. And that tactic was the same one used by women at Brown a quarter of a century ago, when they wrote the names of the men who had raped them on the walls of the library bathroom stalls in order to warn other victims. And at Brown, but in 2014 rather than the 1990s, a survivor spoke publicly this past spring about how the school found responsible the man who had raped and strangled her, and then decided to let him return to campus. 42 years later, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 women is raped during her time in college, a higher rate of assault than that of women who do not attend university. That's a reality that no college brochure ever advertises, and a guarantee that 42 years later, gender inequality is alive and well on our campuses. Why does this continue? It's due in large part, of course, to the reality that we live in a sexist, patriarchal society, one that praises in men aggression, dominance, and not taking no for an answer. The same qualities we tend to see in rapists. A world that tells women to be forgiving and patient and support the men in our lives before ourselves, which are the very same qualities that survivors, no matter their gender, are told by administrators and our families and our friends to adopt. Forgive our assailants, patiently wait a semester or a year or forever for the school to remove him from campus, and stay calm, quiet, and collected, even as we try to seek justice for the violence we've endured. It's also due in part to the Department of Education's lackluster enforcement of the law. In the department's entire history, it has actually never once sanctioned a school for sexual assault-related violations of Title IX, ever. That's due in part to the bluntness of the only real tool explicitly available to the department, removing all federal funding from a non-compliant university. And that would be devastating to students, particularly those dependent on financial aid. We're working with Congress to change that. But as national organizing picks up steam and we win initial victories, we're seeing some schools respond to our work in one way that we didn't anticipate. It's a way that makes me nervous for the next 42 years. As students call upon the power of the law for justice and change on our campuses, some universities are responding by further corporatizing their responses to violence, by looking out more than ever for their bottom line. Last summer, my co-director, Alexander, and I were invited to speak at a risk management firm's conference for Title IX administrators. We went, unsure quite what to expect, but naively very enthusiastic. The head of the firm repeatedly dropped odd little comments about how brave we were to show up in the first place, which probably should have been a sign that there was something off. The entire conference was about risk. Not risk to students per se, but risk to the university. What it is, how to manage it, how to mitigate it, how to keep your school's name out of the papers, how to make sure your school's application rates remain competitive, how to ensure the alumni dollars keep flowing in, how to keep your school from getting investigated by the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, the OCR. This last one was called and I quote, how to OCR-proof your campus. In all of this, there was scarce a mention of student safety, of victims' needs, of justice and equality, which, after all, is the spirit of Title IX. Alexandra and I spoke there about how survivors come away from campus disciplinary hearings feeling that they were treated as liabilities, as entities that needed to be risk managed, rather than as survivors and students. Back at Amherst, following the wave of bad press we created, the school's application rates dropped dramatically. In an interview with our student newspaper, the Dean of Admissions said, quote, "Had what happened in the fall not happened, I would have said it was normal volatility. We were very cognizant in the fall of how much publicity this thing garnered." This thing, of course, wasn't the fact that survivors were mistreated by the school. It was survivors coming forward publicly about how they were mistreated by the school. I bring this up now because I think this language of liability and risk management is really dominant in many schools' conversations about Title IX, even when individual administrators' intentions may be 100% pure. In the age of the growing corporatization of higher education, it's become just how we talk about it. It's a real problem because it fosters an environment in which abuses like the ones I've detailed, in which students are feeling themselves being treated as liabilities, is not only possible, but practically inevitable. Of a piece with this corporatized climate and risk management mentality is a collective unwillingness, I think, to talk about gender-based violence as what it is, gender-based and thus deeply political. At my own school, following the wave of negative publicity, the institution formed a committee, as all schools do in response to anything, to write a report that was so vague, it made rape sound a lot like a thunderstorm that just unexpectedly popped out of the sky and descended upon unknowing, surprised passerbys. There was little discussion of who rapes, how, and why. It suggested holding more outdoor movies to improve sexual respect on campus. Euphemistic language around gender-based violence, words like sexual respect, sexual misconduct, non-consensual sex, these all serve to sanitize the issue and water down our response to it. Now, I think to a certain extent that this corporatization of higher ed is expanding to our movement's response to violence, the effect being that we're not getting much closer to ending it. Last month, the White House unveiled a widely heralded brand new It's On Us campaign. It's a bystander intervention campaign, and on one level, I think it's important and very good. It aims to collectivize our response to sexual assault. This is particularly critical in a world where the responsibility of not being raped so often falls on the shoulders of those of us most likely to be victimized by it. It's On Us invites, quote, everyone to step up and realize that the solution begins with us. But the way the campaign proposes to do this is simultaneously so narrow and so vague. So narrow in that it excludes entire groups of victims. It focuses on sexual assault at a party to the exclusion of other experiences of rape, as well as dating and domestic violence and stalking. And so vague that it renders its message virtually meaningless. So for instance, here are some of the tips on the It's On Us website for bystanders to stop sexual assault. Quote, identify situations in which sexual assault may occur. If you see something, intervene in any way you can. If something looks like a bad situation, it probably is. Get someone to help if you see something. Again, I think we see this same sort of meteorological language as if rape is a bad thunderstorm, unfortunate, inevitable, striking seemingly out of nowhere, and devoid of human agents. The solution then is easy and comfortable. Identify situations in which a sexual assault may occur, and guide your friend to safety. Scan the horizon and remember, if something looks like a bad situation, it probably is. Of course, gender-based violence is not like the weather. It has direct, immediate human agents and is structural and systemic at its core. It's On Us depoliticizes and degenders sexual assault, portraying it as an easy-to-avoid problem solely between individuals and making perpetrators out to be vague someones who do something to other someones. In reality, perpetrators are disproportionately likely to be men, and their victims are disproportionately likely to be women, particularly queer and trans women, women of color, women with disabilities, queer men, and gender nonconforming people. On the glossy new It's On Us website, participants are asked to sign a pledge that rape is bad. Now, I'm always skeptical of campaigns that rely on glossy corporate PR stunts, photo ops, and online pledges, campaigns that praise participants for doing nothing more than agreeing that rape is bad. I don't know anyone who doesn't think rape is bad. I'm sure that the dean who told me to get a job at Starbucks thinks rape is bad. I'm sure that my rapist friends and his father and his mother and his brother think rape is bad. I'm pretty sure that my rapist thinks rape is bad. And yet here we are, living in a world in which 1 in 5 women will be raped in her lifetime, and even more will be abused at some point. A world in which a woman is more likely to be raped if she goes to college than if she doesn't. I often find myself going back to this bell hooks quote. If you go door to door in our nation and talk to citizens about domestic violence, almost everyone will insist that they do not support male violence against women, that they believe it to be morally and ethically wrong. However, if you then explain that we can only end male violence against women by challenging patriarchy, and that means no longer accepting the notion that men should have more rights and privileges than women because of biological differences, or that men should have the power to rule over women, that is when the agreement stops. There's a gap between the values they claim to hold and their willingness to do the work of connecting thought and action, theory and practice to realize these values and thus create a more just society. A friend of mine wrote a strong piece about It's On Us along just these lines. She says, quote, "The horror at Penn State should remain on everyone's minds, but Julie Herman, the athletic director at Rutgers, recently made light of the abuse. Why has Rutgers excused her comments? Why generally has the NCAA, which counts Rutgers as a member, been allowed to sign on as a formal partner to It's On Us after decades of member programs harming survivors with no end in sight? GQ has joined the campaign after ignoring the brave survivors who came forward to say that photographer Terry Richardson abused them. Likely because It's On Us demands very little from participant organizations in the way of accountability, GQ apparently found no contradiction between opposing gender-based violence while funding a known serial perpetrator. Even though these organizations have a significant platform to advertise the campaign and reach the intended audience, their pledges ring hollow as they have failed and continue to fail to take violence seriously. The fact that the NCAA and GQ felt comfortable supporting the campaign demonstrates that It's On Us doesn't go far enough. We must set the bar for allyship somewhere, and this is not it. It's On Us should empower people to call out these institutions, not give them free PR. Now, the It's On Us campaign's failure to conceptualize of violence as systemic and structural guts meaningful responses to it. It's On Us offers a strategy to avoid violence, not meaningfully reduce it. The campaign's tips, like guiding your friends away from perpetrators at parties, are important and might help an individual woman avoid a rapist in an individual instance, but it won't stop that rapist from turning to literally the next girl at the bar and preying on her. It makes the problem seem discreet and manageable, with a quick fix that fits comfortably in our existing structure of how the world works, who has power and who doesn't. It's On Us is so appealing precisely because it doesn't require us to disrupt the status quo. I think, though, that there are real ways to strengthen it, to re-envision what being an ally and a bystander really means. I wrote about it here, and I will read some. It's on you to recognize and dismantle the institutions that tolerate and perpetuate violence. If you go to a school that doesn't expel perpetrators, it's on you to hold your school accountable for its abuses. It's on you not to invite rapists to your parties and not to attend theirs. If your favorite sports team shelters abusers and blames survivors, it's on you to call it out and refuse to support it with your dollars. It's on you to boycott the actors, musicians, and artists that beat up their partners. It's on you to condemn police violence against women of color and to do it loudly and publicly. If you live in a country where your government doesn't hold universities accountable for civil rights violations, like ours, or which locks people up in prisons and detention centers where they are raped at alarming rates, also ours, it's on you to hold your representatives accountable in the streets, at the ballot box, in the press. It's on you to be your own bystander. It should go without saying that you shouldn't rape anyone. You should also make a commitment to recognizing the ways in which you exert power over less privileged folks in your life, the ways in which you may violate someone else's boundaries without realizing it. It's on you to be conscious of the space your voice takes up and not to talk over those with less power. I once attended an anti-rape rally where a group of white male students took away the mic from a female survivor and told her that she was talking too much. It's on you to use your privilege to create space for marginalized folks to speak and be heard. If you're a campus administrator, it's on you to treat survivors with respect and decency, to hold perpetrators accountable, and to give your students the tools to talk about oppression, power, and violence in their lives. Finally, it's on you to reconceptualize what violence is and recognize it in all its forms. We are obsessed in this country, in our press, in our laws, and yes, in our White House bystander intervention campaigns, with an experience of violence that looks like a usually able-bodied, white, upper-middle-class college girl assaulted at a party by an acquaintance. That all-consuming narrative ignores and erases the multitude of experiences of violence that occur on campuses and off, even those that are almost as or more common: rape within a dating relationship, emotional abuse by an intimate partner, or stalking by a current or former partner, for instance. Perhaps we ignore these forms of violence because to recognize them would be to acknowledge violence as both far closer to home and far more insidious than we would like to admit. It's on you to recognize less public forms of violence. It's on you to learn to spot an abusive relationship and guide a dating violence survivor to support. And it's on you to learn that the best ways to support a survivor of a relationship abuse will likely be counterintuitive to you. And so tangibly, on the ground, there are a lot of things that each of us can do to make our campuses safer and more just, no matter whether you're a student or an alum or an administrator or a professor. So first, don't buy into this risk management obsession, and literally don't buy the services of PR professionals who don't care about students. Victim service providers like rape crisis centers and sexual assault and DV coalitions have been on the ground doing this work for decades, and many of them are available to come to your school to help rewrite policy, to train disciplinary officials, and to do prevention programming with students. Use these people. Often they will come free of charge out of the goodness of their hearts and a commitment to the cause, but you should pay them. The work and the movement cannot survive without funding. As a friend of mine once said, there's nothing radical about uncompensated labor. Second, if you are a staff member or a professor at a school, prioritize the needs of survivors in school policies and practices. We list a number of strong policies at the Know Your 9 website, but I will go over a few here. First, ensure that survivors can access crisis services on a 24/7 basis. Many schools that employ staff during the week to provide services experience gaps in the weekend, which is often when survivors need it most. In order to ensure survivors can always access counseling, schools should enter into an MOU with the local rape crisis center or domestic violence shelter that will provide counseling for students after normal business hours. Second, provide amnesty to students who report an assault that they witnessed or experienced while under the influence of alcohol or other drugs. Not doing so keeps survivors quiet and afraid to come forward. 3, inform survivors of their right to retake classes without academic or financial penalty, and designate a staff person to assist survivors in obtaining extensions on academic work from professors. When I left campus, I asked my dean to let my professors know. Telling my professor that I was raped was literally the last thing I wanted to be doing before being bussed back to St. Louis. My dean didn't do this, and I received emails from professors 3 weeks after I'd moved home asking why I wasn't in class. Publicly and annually disclose the number of reports your school receives of sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. We now all know this is the law. This week, Know Your 9 has urged students to look up their school's 2014 Clery reports, which were due October 1st, and alarmingly, many schools aren't doing this. Still others are reporting numbers of domestic or dating violence like 2 or 4 or 6, and if your numbers are that low, that means that you are making it incredibly burdensome and impossible for survivors to report. Provide free transportation to a local hospital for survivors for a rape kit, to court to obtain a civil protection order, and counseling if your school doesn't provide adequate counseling services for dating violence, stalking, and sexual assault survivors on campus. Make it clear that survivors won't suffer academic penalties for missing class while they were seeking a protection order. At survivors' request, immediately remove abusers from survivors' dorm buildings, classes, or other shared spaces. If it isn't possible to remove an abuser, assist the survivor in seeking alternate housing and lock changes if they're being stalked, as well as academic and other accommodations. Ensure confidentiality and privacy for survivors throughout. This should be so obvious, but it's not. Don't publish students on or off-campus addresses without their affirmative consent. Many survivors of dating violence and stalking live in fear of their abusers discovering where they live. If your school mishandles a case, ensure that survivors don't suffer the consequences of that institutional mistreatment. Be particularly attuned to the economic consequences of violence. My school told me that they couldn't refund my tuition, despite the fact that there was no way I could stay on the same campus as my abuser while they waited several months to hear the case, and despite the fact that my dean had pressured me to leave. Their reasoning? If they did it for me, they'd have to do it for anyone else in the same situation, which I think really begs the question of just how many survivors of rape and dating violence were being pressured to leave school and not file complaints. And finally, hire extensively trained investigators and adjudicators who understand the dynamics of sexual assault and abusive relationships, which are often counterintuitive and can take years, not hours, of education to understand. Trained individuals will understand the cycles of abuse and the various tactics abusers use to control and manipulate their victims, often without physical or sexual violence, as well as the reality that most survivors never leave an abusive partner or successfully do so only after a number of attempts. Again, these are just some starting places. There are many more recommendations on the Know Your 9 website. I want to conclude by reading you an email. It's an email that I received my final semester of college just before homecoming, well after all of the bad press and the initial policy changes and the hesitant early grasps at progress at Amherst. I and other students were sent this email by Residential Life. Quote, "Keep an eye out for unwanted sexual advances. A lot of alums come back for homecoming pretty jaded with the bar scene and blind dating of the real world and are eager to take advantage of what they perceive now to be an easy hookup scene back at Amherst. Also, many alums tend to be pretty drunk all weekend long. Alert your residents to this unfortunate combination and keep an eye on your friends, your residents, and yourself." To some of you in this room, this may sound pretty innocuous, even helpful. It tells women to be careful around alums, warns them of the risks, and asks them to look out for their friends. Indeed, the potential future mother in me wants to nod in assent and say, thank you, thank you. But to me, as a woman and a survivor and a student, this email reads to me as resignation, as tolerance on the part of my school, acceptance of the reality that our former students are abusers, that they might abuse you, that their homecoming weekend fun is more important to us than your safety or well-being or belief that you belong here. I want to live in a world where I can walk around my own campus without fear of violence. I want to know that my school has its full weight behind me, not behind abusers who make large donations to the college. It's 2014, and I want, and I think I deserve to feel like a full member of this community by now, and to be valued as a full member. I want to be able to walk while female and be safe. So 42 years later, Title IX's promise remains unfulfilled, but alive. Let's make its dream, equality in education for students of all genders, a reality. Thank you.